Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And also on the podcast, Kirsty Buchanan, who is a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Greetings to you.
Greetings to you also. And Joe Tanner, a political strategist who advises politicians from all political parties. Hello, Joe.
Hello, happy CSR Day.
Well, tell us, why is there a C in front of SR?
Comprehensive,
it's supposed to be
mate.
the comprehensive spending review.
Comprehensive.
It's been given all sorts of names, I'm sure, by lots of people that are on the other side of this at the moment.
Isn't that
Very
the truth?
Complicated for some of us as well, who are fiscally challenged.
Well, I think so. This is it. So this episode is focusing on the comprehensive spending review. We're going to analyse it. We'll tell you what was in it. We'll tell you what it means, and we'll do the politics of it. Is it a big sell from Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor? As you're listening, you can watch as well on YouTube. Just head to YouTube, search for Whitehall Sources. Follow us on X, find us on TikTok, and join our mailing list at whitehallsources.com. Or drop us a WhatsApp message. The number is 0333 404 6507. And start your message with the word Whitehall. So then, to the CSR, as the political nerds among us, i.e. all of us, like to call it, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves has delivered her spending review, setting out budgets for government departments. She says spending on the NHS will rise by 3% a year after inflation, an extra £29 billion per year for the day-to-day running of the health service, she said. Reeves has also confirmed £39 billion for social and affordable housing. There's a boost in defence spending, and a pledge, which was in the Labour Party's manifesto, I believe, to end costly asylum hotels in the next 4 years. Nuclear power stations, rail schemes, roads and housing, all going to be showered in cash as well. Kirsty, there are some big numbers. We will get to those. We're talking about the spending review. What is it? What are we actually talking about today? What does it mean?
Technically, spending review is the process by which a government sets out its spending plans for each government department on a long-term basis. So, to all intents and purposes, this takes us pretty much through the rest of the lifetime of this Parliament. Politically, what it sets out is the government's priorities. So, as expected here, we see that the spending priorities for this government are in part about capital spending, because that is a useful and convenient way of trying to speed growth, as well as obviously being able to tackle the infrastructure backlog that we have in this country and have had for many a year. But nothing puts money into the market quicker than one, quantitative easing, or two, construction projects. So obviously capital, a lot of money spent on capital, and a lot of that was announced in the run-up. A lot of money being spent on the NHS, which we can talk about in some more detail, which I think is worth talking about in some more detail. Definitely. And obviously that uptick in spending for defence, although nowhere near 3% that would... Most people will agree the bare minimum that is required. Alone the 3.5% that the Secretary-General of NATO, Mark Rutte, will be requiring of all NATO members at the big NATO summit in Canada later this month. So those are the priorities. There are plenty of winners and losers, and we'll talk through them. But politically, it's a sort of set out of direction of travel and what the government cares most about going forward, and that is the sort of political backdrop for a CSR.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. And so, Joe, I suppose just again, by way of scene setting, before we get into the details, there's a consideration here, isn't there, about the story of this Labour government's last 12 months or so, 11 months, of financial/fiscal/economic announcements, whether that's around the budget, whether that's on U-turns, and now we get to this spending review as well. Is the pitch, is the sale on this to the public easy or difficult for the Labour government at this point?
It's pretty tough because no one's happy. And also it's come on the back of this kind of, this U-turn on winter fuel. So that the sort of the trust element, I guess, to some extent is a difficult issue. In terms of what you're selling, for pensioners, they didn't really get anything. They weren't even mentioned. It was all about working families. There was a lot of talk about this government's choice. There were repeated phrases like, this is the choice I make, these are the choices of this Labour government. So ultimately, this is the flesh on the bones after an election and complaining for most of last year and the early part of this year about the state of the public's finances. This is about saying, well, now we've been able to supposedly turn the economy around, fix the foundations, whatever phrase you want to use. This is us now making some big bold plans. And there's welcome stuff in there, but at the same time, I think there are going to be considerable questions about the gaps. It provides another opportunity for all the experts and for the opposition to say where all the holes are in what's been announced, and raise more questions about, Rachel Reeves' competence and this government's sort of fiscal competence in terms of how much are they betting everything on a few things continuing to go their way, if they do go their way at all.
So then that gets us into the detail of this thing to sort of try to pick apart some of these things. I think you're right, Joe. No one's happy. And that's the problem. Rachel Reeves is trying to sell this idea that things are getting better. And I'm just not sure that's people's reality right now. So then let's have a little look at some of the details. So I'm going to just say this. Government departments facing the biggest cuts to average annual real growth. This is by 2028 to 2029. Transport, minus 8.6%. The Foreign Office, minus 5%. The Home Office, minus 2.2%. The Cabinet Office, minus 2.2%. Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, minus 0.7%. And then there's a few others floating around there as well. So then, it seems clear, Kirsty, that the NHS health is the biggest winner, if I can say it like that, by way of actual money, rising by 3% every year, an extra £29 billion for the next 3 years. Wes Streeting has come out on top.
Yes, he has. Look, there's a couple of things I wanted to kind of say in terms of narrative from the get-go on which was the foundations from which this spending review was launched. One, the Chancellor said, look, the world has fundamentally changed. Has it? Has it fundamentally changed in the last few months since the budget? I don't think so. Things have got marginally worse in terms of conflict, but this drive towards defence spending is motivated by politics rather than the realities on the ground of things getting fundamentally more difficult or more dangerous than they were. And the second one is that, we've fixed the foundations, we've sorted out the economy, and now we're on a chance to reap the benefits of that, which was the rationale by which they restored the winter fuel allowance, but it's the rationale on which they're building the spending review. And that doesn't bear an awful lot of scrutiny either. Inflation is still at 3.4% climbing. The jobs market is weakening. Unemployment is at the highest level for 4 years. I'll be fascinated to see how the bond markets react to this borrowing spree that she has embarked on. So, the two foundations of it, have things really got considerably worse and that justifies a kind of change of political tack? I don't think so. And have they really fixed the foundations of the economy to allow for such largesse? I don't think so either. So, having said all that, by popular kind of consent, demand and most polls, the NHS needs, deserves and should get more money. The issue with that, as always with the NHS, is that does not come with a consequential increase in productivity. Anybody that follows the fabulous Paul Johnson, who is the head of the equally fabulous Institute for Fiscal Studies, have a look at his Twitter feed. It doesn't bear sort of relating on a podcast, but there is a great graph on there, a bar chart graph, which shows increases in workforce in the NHS since 2019, and a much smaller chart next to it of increases in productivity. And at some point you've got to sort of say, well, when do these huge increases in funding come with consequential reforms attached to them? And I speak as someone who worked in a government that put, at the time, the single biggest increase into NHS funding on record, which at the time I think was 20 billion. But that needs to come with consequential reform. Productivity right across public sector and private sector is struggling, but it is particularly acutely bad in the NHS. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what Wes Streeting does in terms of that reforming to drive up productivity with the NHS. It will be the other thing that sort of the story that hasn't kind of played itself out yet, but hopefully will come through Wes Streeting's reform agenda, is how much of a role AI will play in NHS productivity improvements. We are beginning to scrape the surface of the consequences of AI and its ability to make real transformational change in public services. And nowhere do I think that will become more acutely needed than within the NHS, We have an increasingly ageing population. An ageing population all comes with chronic complex health concerns. They are all very expensive to treat. So hopefully AI might fill in that gap, if you like, between extra money being shovelled at it and productivity kind of flatlining.
But there must be some fear in government, because you've just seen a major company like Marks and Spencer's taken down by a significant cyber attack, and the fear around the ability of any government to be able to implement a decent IT project, let alone to sort of bet your house on putting everything onto using tech as the solution, and then being able to ensure that it withstands any future challenges. When only last year a blood bank got taken out by a cyber attack, and it meant that hospitals were cancelling patients' sort of operations and stuff left, right and centre. So I still think there's an interesting conversation to have about how much the government is actually going to be able to invest to protect not only this, they've got to invest in the systems to start with, and then they've got to make sure they withstand the pressures that will inevitably be laid upon them by other forces, which I think is going to be the bit that is an evolving threat they will have to continue to work on. And I'm not even sure the bill for that is even understood. We know that the private sector is grappling with this massively. The boss of HSBC said at a select committee hearing recently that cybersecurity was the thing that kept him awake at night. So that's
all the more reason, Joe, you might think then to actually increase our defence budget, which includes cybersecurity, to what is really needed, rather than what you can low-hanging fruit fund through cutting international aid money. We still have a 2.6% now, I think it is, pledged to 2027. We have no idea when we're going to meet 3%, let alone 3.5%, and no idea how that's going to be funded. But I don't think things have fundamentally got worse or different since the start of the year. I think they've been bad for many years now. But if you really care about cybersecurity, if you care about securonomics as much as Rachel Reeves says she does, and if the budget for defence is supposed to be as important as the budget for NHS, all the more reason to find the funding for it that it actually really needs, rather than what you can politically easily do.
So then, are there places that are really losing out as a result of what the health department has got? Joe, if we're to have a look at things like the police, for example, that they're kind of not overly convinced by the sound of it as to how much they're getting. This from Stephen Swinford at the Times. Police, quote, core spending power will increase by 1.7% a year over the course of this parliament, but police think this will not be enough to retain existing numbers, let alone the recruitment of 13,000 new officers, which is a Labour government target. They also expect to say they won't be able to fulfil flagship pledges to have knife crime and violence against women and girls. Stephen Swinford says a big row is brewing. There's more on this to come later this afternoon. There will be those departments and those services that feel like they're not able to live up to what this Labour government is demanding of them.
Yeah, and I think we've had this big issue about prison places and about the fact that we're going to be, looking at shorter sentences, letting people out early. Well, what about the ability to actually sort of prevent crime or to deal with much smaller, lower level crime quickly, so that we stop those cases of reoffending or people that sort of get into worse forms of crime and become a bigger problem for society? Interestingly, Sadiq Khan has just released a statement saying that he's been determined to stand up for London. It's good news they've won extra resources for transport and housing, and he's been campaigning for years for a multi-year deal, which he got. However, he says, I remain concerned the spending review could result in insufficient funding for the Met and fewer police officers. It's also disappointing there is no commitment today from the Treasury to invest in new infrastructure London needs, and he's talked about the DLR, for example. But that's, the capital city, to be concerned about policing numbers in the capital city, where that is an area where people do feel things have got worse. People genuinely feel on a day-to-day basis that they are more likely to be the victim of crime than probably they have done for some time. Only this week, my husband's motorbike was stolen from outside our house. Miraculously, we hadn't noticed it had been stolen. It was actually the police ringing us to tell us they'd found it. That meant that we knew it had been stolen.
Oh my goodness.
But
that's always these days, isn't it?
I was like, that is the police doing the job for you. We didn't even have to report it.
Please recover stolen goods, shocker.
We did, exactly. but recover stolen goods before even reported as stolen. They were like, why is your bike parked in a park? And it was like, well, it's not. It's supposed to be outside the house. So, the unbelievable sort of, effort of the police was incredible there. But how many times are people doom scrolling, picking up their phones and seeing someone they know's phone being stolen, someone being attacked, something sort of happening. Look at Robert Jenrick and his fair evasion video. These are the things that really matter to people. And if you're starting to say that there is a fear about police numbers and the government's line is, well, we're going to get rid of all the asylum hotels and as a result we're going to save a load of money, we'll have more money then to spend on things like policing, I'm not sure the public's going to buy that, because they've seen successive governments fail to deal with the asylum issue. So how are they suddenly going to magic up money to mean that there's more bobbies on the street? And let's be clear, there is still really no direction from this government about how they're going to deal with inefficiencies, which is what every political party has pinned their hat on for years, that we're going to save money in public services. There's no real sense of any of that in what's been announced.
Well, so Robert Peston at ITV has just posted, literally as you've been speaking, Joe, about efficiency savings. So, and he's taken a picture of the book that accompanies a spending review like this, the document. He says, here's an extraordinary government claim of £13.8 billion of efficiency savings it's promising each year by 2028-2029. Health and social care is promising to provide more than £9 billion of them. Is that credible, asks Robert Peston. The second biggest promiser of efficiency gains is defence.
Spoiler alert, no, it's not credible.
Things, is the 13.8 billion credible and is the 9 billion from health credible?
No and no.
Right.
A couple of things here about the politics of this too. It is interesting that Rachel Reeves started her speech on the spending review referencing not only the Liz Truss mini budget, but also reforms £80 billion worth of unfunded spending commitments. There is quite an eye here to a government that is looking over its shoulder at the kind of insurgent reform threat. A lot of money. I mean, when we're talking about people that lose out, Sadiq Khan has actually lost out quite a lot compared to the money that's being funneled in kind of the Midlands and the North to prop up those red wall seats in defence against reform. And similarly, there was a section where she went all Doge-esque in her speech and railed against inefficiency and promised to root it out. I mean, look, if I had £1 for every time I'd listened to a government talk about rooting out waste in government, I wouldn't have to be working for a living anymore. I'd probably be retired on some private island that I'd bought with all these pounds. So one, there's just that kind of common understanding that these sorts of promises are a bit like closing tax loopholes. You hear them, you make up fantasy figures about what you hope to get and an answer comes there none. And if you want a real world example of that, look at what happened in the United States. Musk came in promising a kind of Doge style clawback of funding of about $3 trillion. And he's left with, less than a third of that being met. And that's simply by salami slicing services. That's got nothing to do with finding genuinely unnecessary spending or producing radical, meaningful reform that saves money. That's just going salami slice. And that still didn't get anywhere near as $3 trillion. So, look, no, I don't think the answer to that is Rachel Reeves going all, Elon Musk on us and promising Doge. I think there's got more to do with reform breathing down their neck than anything else. And just to Joe's point about, and this is a joke before anyone pulls me up on it, I really wish someone would steal Rob Jenrick's phone.
Very good.
Well, you've just incited that on a podcast now.
I'm sorry.
Shocking.
Joke. But if I see one more tired video of that man in a Marks and Spencer's hoodie harassing members of the public.
Kirsty, you and millions of others see those videos.
And ask for it. If you want a job as a journalist, go be a journalist. Otherwise, do your day job.
Yeah, this is Bobby J on the beat, though, isn't it?
It is. He's waiting for his hat, I think. He's going to get maybe special caps made up or something.
I'm telling you,
his underwear over his trousers.
This is politics by vibes. The crossover between, Zenta-style journalism and politics is becoming ever more blurred. Brackets David.
It's Portillo, the hospital porter, all over.
Well, and David Bull just becomes the chairman of reform, etc. And Farage cemented his popularity off the back of going on, "Oh, I'm a celebrity," to remind people where he was before he decided to come back into politics again. I mean, look, this is the sort of thing that we see, writ large in America, but it's definitely coming here.
But for your point on reform, just a very quick side point. It's very interesting that you make that point, Kirsty, because David Ball is saying that his job is to get out on the airwaves and to do that job for reform, which is something that Nigel Farage's thought was clearly a huge part of his appeal. And I'm sure one Richard Tice and Lee Anderson will be rather concerned that they're not. Are they going to get a look in? That's going to be really interesting time. And Nigel Farage got at least 2 call outs from Rachel Reeves during that speech, if not 3. So I would say, though, that to the point about efficiencies, I go back to that point I made about cybersecurity.
Yeah.
We know that major government transformation projects never go very well. They always end up overspending. They always end up being incredibly complicated. Some never actually see the light of day or end up in lengthy court cases as well, where people sue each other because things don't go very well. So the idea that you're going to make significant savings because of things that you're going to bring in, I think is absolute nonsense. I'd have thought you'd be spending far more in the short term to get those things in, and you would see longer term savings, but possibly like 10 years down the line. I cannot see how, when you're putting new technologies in, that's going to give you pretty much real time savings. I mean, that's what you'd be betting on with the sorts of numbers that they're talking about. And we know that most hospitals, I've been in a hospital where the heating has been set at some ridiculous temperature and patients have got fans on them to try and cool them down. And because it's all centrally controlled, someone can't, change a light or turn off turn down a thermostat because of the way that things are run. So the idea that you're going to suddenly smash the system overnight, I just think is nonsense.
Right, so we're finding a bit of a sort of credibility gap, perhaps, in what's in the spending review. Perhaps we can add to that this from Alex Wickham, who is, of course, the political editor for Bloomberg. Just on defence, he says defence spending will have to rise from 2.6% in 3.5% in 2032 to meet the aforementioned NATO target. That does not sound plausible, he suggests. So that's another thing to add to the list of we're not quite sure how this is going to work. What else have I got on my list here? So yes, we've mentioned defence, we've mentioned the NHS. Education's been touted as perhaps a bit of a winner in this for Bridget Phillipson. Let me just find my notes on the education, because the Education Policy Institute said there'd been a significant cash increase in school funding, although the director of the EPI says the cost of delivering extra free school meals, plus inflation, plus the new teachers' pay settlement is going to eat into this overall rise of £4.7 billion in cash terms by 2028-2029. They do warn of inadequate resources to deliver the reforms that the DFE want to see in school-age education for children in England who have special educational needs and disabilities as well. And they're also worried that without the child poverty strategy, schools will continue to have to firefight, provide clean uniforms and pastoral care, and deal with all of that. Joe, I don't know, I think just the more reaction that we're getting both here on the pod and from others that's coming in as we're recording today, it just feels like there's a lot of big shiny numbers on this, but the reality is kind of a bit of an unfathomable, how is this going to make sense? How is this going to actually be possible?
And that's exactly what Paul Johnson from the IFS has already said. He said there's been a lot of stuff. It's almost hard to keep up with the amount of numbers that were being thrown out. Several questions about what really all of that meant. And I thought what was really interesting is that supposedly this morning, Ben Riley-Smith said from the Telegraph, said earlier that Keir Starmer started his cabinet meeting this morning sort of saying that essentially this today marked the end of the first phase of this government, and now it was about the new phase and about sort of showing where their commitment, where their sort of focus was, their commitments were. And actually, it's very interesting that narrative is that we're drawing a line somewhere. So now it's almost, in my view, risking open season, that from today onwards, this is where everything gets really blamed on Labour for what happens. Because if you're saying, well, before that, you were just kind of getting in and finding out, measuring up the curtains still and finding out that which ones were flea ridden or, where the moths were, etc. You're now actually saying, well, this is you properly in the driving seat and this is what you're doing. There's going to be an interesting series of measures against that. And it certainly doesn't appear that there are as many happy people as perhaps Labour were hoping straight away.
Yeah. There perhaps isn't as much electoral nectar as well as they might have been hoping. So this pledge on asylum hotels, Kirsty, it's pointed out that asylum costs will still be £2.5 billion by the time of the next election. So that's going to be a difficult one for Labour to campaign on. So a lot of these things are not making the issues go away if they want to sort of cut through in the minds and hearts, indeed, of the electorate.
Yeah, look, this was all set out internally. This was all set out when Labour came in. Year 1 was fixing the foundations. Year 2 was beginning to do the build back. I have to say, if you don't think the foundations are fixed, I'm a bit worried about how shonky my new house is going to look. And if this is a government about growth, and this is a government about deliverism, I don't think you'd meet anybody that knows anything about housing that you think that those 1.5 million homes will be delivered that were promised. I find it hard to believe that the NHS targets will be met. Still holding out hope on smashing the gangs. Good luck with that one. Growth, we've talked ad nauseum about the issues of growth, and on the one hand, you're taking an awful lot of our money that you will come to us in taxes, probably in the budget later on this year, to try and pump money into construction and building to try and speed the growth that you're not getting from private sector because of your original sin as a Chancellor of saying, right, we're going for growth, and then slapping more and more costs onto businesses. Businesses in Britain are the engines of growth. Businesses in Britain are the people that set the kind of tone for the country and draw in investment. Investment in this country is falling through the floor. The jobs market is beginning to drop off a cliff. Unemployment is rising. So you've still got this weird kind of dichotomy. On the one hand, you're taking an awful lot of public sector money that we will have to fund in the shape of rising taxes and trying to pump that round the economy to get that growth that you're not getting by stimulating growth through the private sector, by allowing businesses to do what they do best, because you've put additional burdens on them, and those burdens will keep on coming. So, if you say this is about deliverism, you've set yourself a bunch of targets, and your whole foundational pillar is around trust and growth. Like I say, the narrative that was set out this morning, such as it was, feels, to put it generously, a little bit overspun. To put it ungenerously, is downright duplicitous. And the mechanisms by which you are going to try and stimulate growth that you've not been able to stimulate because you've put the sort of brakes on business is done off the back of some really dangerous levels of borrowing. Really dangerous levels of borrowing. We spend, £100 billion a year servicing debt at the moment in this country. That's money that if we started to pay down our debt, we could use on public service delivery. That leaves us dangerously overburdened. If there's any kind of external shocks that this government has no control over in a Trump world and in a world of conflict and in a dangerous new world that we keep on being told that we live in now, brackets all of a sudden, the chances that we're not going to be subjected to some of those. The gilt yields are already, dangerously high, higher than most other market economy. This is all, a kind of Jenga tower of borrowing built on a cliff. The whole thing for me feels almost like I want to sort of say, look, when you're in a black hole, stop digging.
Yeah. Dan Hodges, commentator at the Mail on Sundays, just posted his take. The next election is 4 years away, so why has Rachel Reeves just chosen to spend like a drunken sailor on shore leave in the Chagos Islands? Asks Dan Hodges. So then,
do you know, funny enough, drunken sailor on shore leave was exactly the analogy I was thinking of earlier on when I was thinking about what she's spending.
Yeah.
We are now forecast to borrow £200 billion more than under the previous government's borrowing estimates. £200 billion more on a gamble that it will stimulate growth in this country. And who is going to pay for that? It'll be the taxpayer. Now, when you have a budget last year, when you say, right, this is the highest tax burden that we've placed on businesses and individuals on record, but don't worry, folks, we won't be doing this again. These are extraordinary circumstances. And then, a year later, you come back and say, or actually, more extraordinary circumstances, can we have some more money off you, please?
Joe, the narrative then of this spending review. I mean, Stephen Swinford describes at the heart of her spending review as a big bazooka, £113 billion package of capital spending. And perhaps that will cut through to people. You know, they might see actual results, £15 billion in local transport, £14 billion for Sizewell C, £39 billion for social housing, £86 billion for research and development. A lot of it is about what can we get action on as quickly as possible. She was also keen to talk about the choices that she has made in all of this as well, that she had listened to voters throughout this last 10 or 11 months of being in office. In terms of what the government, what the Chancellor has done today, is there an argument to say that when I think I've criticised this government before for sort of saying, oh, we don't have a choice, we had to do this, we didn't have a choice, this is all we could do. Now she's kind of owning it. She's saying these are my choices, these are Labour choices. They're trying to sort of deliver some sense of we are in control, we are making good decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, if this was a runaway car that they'd been wrestling with to get hold of the steering wheel, they are now saying we are firmly strapped into the driving seat now, and they are therefore, as I said earlier, they're going to have to take significant responsibility now for everything. They can't just be blaming other people, other forces, other things. This is very I've been critical of Rachel Reeves, and I get all of the points that Kirsty's made, and I think they're all valid. And the idea that we're all going to be paying more in tax at some point scares the living daylights out of me. But at the same time, part of me wants to go on, girl, have some gumption and believe in Britain's... Because I was so fed up with how down they were when they came in and how much they talked down the country, that the idea of sort of saying we're going to invest in nuclear and we're going to do these things... I think, yes, we need some optimism and we need some drive to say we can be great again. We can make our own steel and we can build things and we can, she talks about building stuff to last. And genuinely, I think that is what a lot of people voted for last year. I think a lot of people were voting for something different and to put something back into the UK and to see some positives. Then Labour turned up and just said it was all terrible and they didn't really know what to do. And then we're going to do something we didn't tell you we were going to do. And we had the winter fuel situation. Then we had, the budget, and we had the sort of rises in national insurance, which we're seeing now the effect of. We're seeing more and more commentary about people that are losing jobs. We're seeing more and more businesses that are talking about the cost to their runner business because of the cost of employing people. So when you then are standing up and saying we're doing all this and we're making choices for working people like you out there, well, some of those people haven't even got a job anymore. They're not working anymore. They're going to be adding to a bill that has also got to be tackled, which is the welfare bill. So I kind of, maybe I'm a bit sad about these things, but I want a government to do well. I don't care what colour the government is. I don't care about the sort of politics of it in that sense. Mm-hmm. I care about the fact that you can't want a government to fail. A government needs to succeed. But I have a fear that I think is echoed by what Kirsty's saying about, have they really got control? Maybe they've got their hands on the steering wheel, but have they got any idea how to change gear? Do they know where the handbrake is? Do they know where the indicators are? Because it just feels like they're like, what is in the back of this vehicle that is coming down the line that we're going to find? Are we going to open the boot and all go, it is worrying because there's no way. The numbers are huge and they're scary and we need them to know what the hell they're doing. But when you're hearing stuff from the likes of the IFS and plenty of others, it does worry you.
Look, everybody who has, any sense at all should want a government to succeed. And I like to think of myself as an equal opportunities hater when it comes to problematic policies. And this is about poor policy choices for me. It's not about policies. I hope I've never said anything particularly disobliging about Rachel Reeves as a person. It is simply that I think she is making the wrong choices and has done since the budget. Look, Joe, when you sort of say, people voted for Labour, a couple of things about that. One,
well, most everyone did, let's face it.
Most people didn't. It was a very, it was a 33% vote for Labour, and that's why we called it a loveless landslide. And frankly, if a bunch of howler monkeys had stood against a Conservative candidate last year, they would have got elected on the basis of the fact that, after 14 years of not the last 14 years, but certainly the last 5 or 6 years of some pretty appalling, self-indulgent and sometimes violent, sometimes illegal behaviour, anybody that said, we're not them, this is the running joke you used to have, all their manifesto needs to say is open it up and just say, we're not the Tories on every page. Yeah. And that's it. So, you've come in, you've promised change, and what you've actually delivered is, it's very hard to see how you decouple yourself from, like I say, that original sin in the budget of saying, trust us, we're going to go for growth, and then you put the brakes on the engine of growth, the real engine of growth in this country, the entrepreneurs, the businessmen, the people that hire people, by burdening business so heavily with taxes. It's very hard to decouple from that. And then the really tough choices that you should be making, you're caving on them. If you can't stand firm on £1.5 billion worth of winter fuel, you're not going to stand firm. And there's an argument about PIP, and I actually think PIP is the wrong benefit to cut, etc., etc. But you're not going to stand firm on the tough choices. So ultimately, we end up with a really old-fashioned Conservative Labour government that borrows, and spends, and then taxes us to pay for it all. All of which, by the way, I could just about forgive if I thought it would do anything in terms of productivity or growth. But at the moment, all the economic indicators and all the modelling suggest that won't happen, and my services won't improve. And Calum, to your point about capital spending, takes years and years to come to fruition. I actually agree that we need Sizewell C. I think nuclear is a vital component in terms of reaching net zero and having a much more diverse and secure energy mix. But the reality is nuclear is a phenomenally expensive way of providing energy in this country. And for at least 10 years, we will be paying the £14 billion bill for building that without it producing a single watt of electricity for our homes or for our cars. And that's on a good best case scenario. On a best case,
if they stick to the numbers, right?
Yeah, on a best case scenario.
On how much they have to spend before the taxpayer steps in.
So look, our energy supply is very, very expensive. Nothing about that, as far as I can see, is fixing the problem. It's actually embedding a problem of a very expensive electricity supply, which again, along with burdening businesses with more taxes and more regulations, we're a difficult country to invest in because we have some of the most expensive energy in the Western world.
And I didn't hear about hydrogen, for example, and we know that energy has been one of the big concerns in the industrial strategy, which has been pushed back because it appears that although it's supposed to be developed with business, it doesn't sound like they're very happy about what's in it. So some of the feedback has been they're back to the drawing board on some of the points. And perhaps had that been published alongside this, we might have seen some more around the plan for business. But they've got a short window to come up with a very good and impressive narrative to say something positive about the business outlook with what the industrial strategy is designed to do. But to your point, Kirsty, I think you're absolutely right. Some of this stuff is such a long-term investment that there's just nothing, there's nothing immediate that anyone's really going to see in terms of a benefit. The only thing you're going to hope, I presume, is that the noise and the words are going to give some confidence to people about the potential of investment. But my worry is that they still had that huge window they lost last year because they were talking down the country so much. And also, forgive me, but what was the biggest glaring error in that speech today? What happened to the missions? Where were the bloody missions? All we heard about were the sodding missions and what was going to happen. And we've heard nothing. No one cares about the missions anymore. Missions are supposed to be like you were going to cut everyone in half. And there they were, like emblazoned on Pat McFadden's chest and others. And yet no one talks about them anymore. But that was all about what this government were going to do and how it all threaded together. But there were just a lot of numbers. It was like a sort of bit of bingo, really, in terms of calling stuff out. Without any of it being that threaded together, apart from, as Kirsty said, growth, which isn't enough, really.
The missions have been buried in a lead-lined coffin with the Edstone.
With the Edstone.
With the Edstone, yeah.
Gone, but not
and probably
forgotten.
some Chinese knotweed or something as well.
And on top of the missions and the headstones, obviously all the other things that came with the missions, the pillars and the steps and the...
I mean, we
Do you
built
remember
upon
all
the
that?
missions. Yeah, the missions got built upon with even more stuff, and then the whole lot's been buried.
Do you remember
It's quite a full
the
coffin.
chart someone made of how they all link together? And it was the most confusing thing I've ever seen in my life.
It was like one of those Who Shagged Who in the Daily Mail that used to get like a double-page spread. It was one of those like, once upon a time, this person used to go to the same school and they then kissed so-and-so behind the bike sheds, and that means they've hated them forever and they've tried to get them dropped from this soap opera. It was always that sort of stuff. It was great.
Love it.
It was brilliant.
Can I point out a couple of other things?
Very quickly, yeah, go on.
Very quickly. One, I'm going to make a prediction, perhaps a dangerous one.
Bold.
One of the things that will unravel very quickly from this is the triumphant language around the biggest boost in social and affordable housing in a generation. Now, bear in mind
39 billion quid.
39 billion quid. Now, bear in mind that Angela Rayner herself grew up in a council house. This is very close to her heart. I suspect when we start to look at the details of that, there will be more about affordable housing than social housing. We have 1.3 million people and 200,000 children living in temporary accommodation because we don't have the social housing for them. I suspect that will be a new front against, within the left of the party saying, where is the promise of the social housing that you said that you would deliver? And this has got nothing to do with the spending review, except that it was buried in a way that bad news frequently is when there's a big ticket event, which I think will grow and grow as a story, particularly after the Chagos Islands, is while we're all looking in that direction, the government has handed over border control in Gibraltar to Spain and the EU. I think that will create a huge backlash on the right.
Really interesting. Do you have any predictions on which we can end the podcast, or should we? I'm happy if you don't. That was an unexpected treat
Do you know
from
what?
Kirsty to get a prediction.
Yeah, I think we should get like a little costume. Like we should put one of those like Ruby tea leaf kind of sort of headdresses on or something, Kirsty, when we can have some special music when we're going to do a prediction. It could be like a little feature of the pod,
I used to say to Calum, we had this, and it was that music from "There May Be Trouble Ahead," and it was supposed to be
like X-Files or something.
An occasional series where I acted like Cassandra on the ramparts of Troy and predicted doom and gloom on the horizon,
We can bring it back.
So, yeah, or I could just sing it every time because I like to go,
So,
there may be trouble ahead.
Trouble I foresee is, aside from Rachel's own fortunes, which I've talked about before and have concerns for, I think it's going to be schools. I think we're going to see teachers. I think we're going to see teachers very unhappy. And I think we're going to hear more and more about the pressures of what's going on within schools, particularly around
summer
the
of strikes.
Well, honestly, you can see it coming, can't you? You can see a situation where we're going to have more and more unrest in various public services who are going to be asked to do more for less and, in some cases perform small miracles on a daily basis, which is a big ask.
Yeah. Right. Thank you very much, both. We will leave it there. There's lots to think about. More free school meals on the way, better libraries and pools, higher council tax. That's all from the BBC News website. The £3 bus fare caps continuing. Winter fuel payment is back for most pensioners this year. There might be changes to your energy bill. More homes, whether there will be affordable homes, social housing, whatever. All of these things to look out for as the analysis continues of the spending review in the days ahead. Of course,
and still no growth.
And keep an eye, get your magnifying glass out to see if you can spot some growth at any point in the next few years as well. Of course, we'll keep considering all the implications of the spending review as they arise on the podcast, where we drop into your feed every single week. Thank you to Joe, thank you to Kirsty, and we will talk to you again soon.